Hi, everyone, and welcome to this discussion on disinformation and political warfare in the age of COVID-19. I have two outstanding experts, Thomas Rid, who's the professor of strategic studies and the author of an outstanding recent book. I would strongly encourage you to buy it, Active Measures, The Secret History of Disinformation and Political Warfare. And then Heather Conley, she's the Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic at CSIS. She's Director of the Europe Program and the author of two outstanding studies on aspects of what we're going to talk about today, Kremlin Playbook and the Kremlin Playbook 2. Please, if you have questions, go onto the link for this and you can ask questions. We'll talk as a group for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll go to your questions. There's a component on the link where you can ask questions, so please do that. I'm Seth Jones, the Harold Brown Chair at CSIS and the Director of the Transnational Threats Project. So let's get into first the current situation with information disinformation, and then we're going to get into a little bit of the history, particularly playing off of Thomas's recent book, Active Measures, and then we'll look at the future. So start with the present, move to the past, and then get into the future. Thomas, why don't we start with you as we look as you look at Russian, Chinese, and U.S. activity today. How would you characterize what's going on around COVID?
Yeah, that's a tough first question because what we're seeing certainly is politicians and top officials from China and frankly also from the United States sometimes trying to spin the COVID-19 story, trying to call into question or come up with alternative theories of the origin of the virus. And but I hesitate to call that disinformation or active measures, to use that old term of art, because we're not looking, it appears, it's early days, we don't know yet, but we're not looking at a systematic, bureaucratic, professional output of intelligence bureaucracies here. We're looking at, if you like, spontaneous spinning and sometimes lying in order to salvage reputations and personal careers. So there's a difference between intelligence bureaucracies running covert operations, active measures, disinformation campaigns, like what we've seen in 2016, and the spontaneous lying that we see today.
So, Thomas, just briefly, how would you, just to be clear about this, how would you define active measures and disinformation, for example, and how would you distinguish it from just political leaders lying?
Yeah, so in my book, I tackled that question up front. And what I'm looking at in the book extensively is active measures as the output of active measures is a term that the Soviet bloc intelligence agencies came up with in the 1960s. They discovered that talking about disinformation is in some ways not helpful because it focuses the mind too much on the distinction between false and correct, between fact and between forgery and truth. But active measures are active when they tap into existing fears, into existing frictions and cleavages, and then amplify something that is already existing. So you have usually some element of forgery, oftentimes limited to the identity of the source of information or the speaker itself. So a front organization would, amplify a KGB or a CIA message. But in some cases, in fact, in some of the most important cases, there is no forgery of the content. So some active measures aren't wrongful or aren't misinformation, so to speak. They're just spun information in a destructive way. And finally, these operations are usually targeted towards an end. When you see the memos of how they're planned, there is an objective, just like for any operation, intelligence or military operation, that they want to achieve with the operation.
Good, thanks. Heather, you've been watching very closely what's going on in Europe and how some of the lies that have been spun coming out of multiple capitals are being viewed in Europe. So can you talk a little bit about Russian, Chinese, and even US actions and how the Europeans are viewing them?
Yes, thanks so much, Seth. Great to be with you. Yes, I think the good news here is that really Europe, the European Union has been increasingly vigilant about malign influence, disinformation operations, and the creation in the European External Action Service of a strategic communications office has been very alert and attuned to disinformation operations. So they're identifying the problem. But I think in some ways it demonstrates, particularly for Europe, on Chinese, the introduction of Chinese disinformation, which has been a real challenge politically to Europe. And of course, the controversy in April, where an initial draft of a report that was highlighting particularly Chinese disinformation was eventually watered down a little bit because of criticism from the Chinese government. And I think again and again, the EU is encountering the political navigation, if you will, of highlighting disinformation and educating disinformation. But I would say Europe is much more attuned to it, the UK, others, Germany. We even have had, in some ways, the historical backward-looking of attempts of Russian disinformation that go back to 2015 in Germany in the lead up to the 2017 parliament elections, of how Russia is hacking into whether it's Angela Merkel's emails or the Christian Democratic Union Party's emails or the German parliament's. We saw that in 2017 with the 2017 French presidential election. So they're much more attuned and alert, and I think this is fantastic. I think the US is exactly the same place. We're much more attuned and alert. But as Thomas was saying, the challenge is the disinformation is being used, is exploiting the weaknesses that our governments and our leaders and our societies are presenting. That's what they're amplifying. There are different objectives for Russian and Chinese disinformation for sure, but they are able to exploit those weaknesses. So I would give the report card for Europe progress. They're highlighting the issue. I think they're recognizing it, trying to do what they can, but the politics of this get very, very difficult. And the Chinese in particular right now are making this very politically difficult for Europe.
So what are some examples, Heather, that you're seeing right now? What are examples of this surrounding COVID that you're seeing in Europe? What are whether it's on the origins of COVID or other aspects? Or what are you seeing the predominant types of misinformation, disinformation, lies, or other kinds of activity?
Sure. Let me talk about Russian use, and then I can move quickly to the Chinese disinformation. Again, we're seeing the same, very similar patterns in the US. So I think you can almost take this as transatlantic disinformation. Again, the use of fear and confusion. It plays on both. It also, again, creates, again, this is a lot of what I would argue greatest hits of some classic Russian disinformation going back into the 1980s, Operation Denver, and suggesting through a very successful disinformation campaign that the HIV/AIDS virus was caused by a U.S. weapons laboratory, biological laboratory, that it was the CIA that did this. So you are seeing that coming through, that the origins, perhaps not coming from Wuhan, but this is from U.S. biological agents. In fact, there is a center in Tbilisi, Georgia, the Luger Center, which is to help discover these types of vaccines. Russian disinformation said, well, that's where the virus came from the Republic of Georgia, using the anti-vaccine groups. So using groups that already have a predilection to concern, amplifying their concerns, entering their chat rooms and things like that to create confusion. And so we're seeing it's a US origin. The fanning of far-right extremist voices, conspiracy theorists, to create that confusion, lack of trust in governments and institutions. Don't believe what you're hearing from the authorities. We really know what's true. So that's really sort of the Russian disinformation bucket. The Chinese disinformation bucket's slightly different. This is really focused on trying to prevent criticism of the origins of the virus coming from Wuhan, certainly. And you're now seeing a much more aggressive Chinese posture, particularly diplomatically, that if a government speaks any criticism of the Chinese initial response to the virus, there's very focused effort. Of course, the shipment of humanitarian supplies, wanting to get credit for that, but with the medical supplies, you cannot criticize. That's caused concern. The Russians have also used humanitarian supplies, both in the U.S., the U.S. purchased Russian medical supplies. Of course, the U.S. just sent to Russia U.S. medical supplies. But the delivery of a Russian field hospital to Italy had some speculation and concern that some of the employees of that field hospital may have been intelligence specialists. So there's lots of distrust on both sides, even when there's a humanitarian gesture that should be positive. It has a double-edged sword.
Thomas, let me turn to you about the mediums that countries are using today. Obviously, most people are going to be aware of information or disinformation put out on social media, but there are also lots of other options, including hacking into computer systems and then leaking information. How do you see, what are the primary tools you see as being used along these lines?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, but I wondered if I can quickly loop back to Heather's response and add a twist that I think we can see in the archives coming out. Is that okay, Seth? So Operation Denver, which was the KGB and Stasi, in fact, also code name for the operation, the infection sometimes is the term that is used. The operation that spreading the myth that AIDS is an American bioweapon developed in Maryland, which evolved out of another operation in Southeast Asia. The goal here was to distract from the Soviet use, from the Soviet Union's use of chemical and biological weapons and their renewed development inside the Soviet Union at the time. The operation is fascinating on a number of levels. One of them is that they picked up the rumor, the conspiracy theory that AIDS is an American creation, government creation. They didn't come up with it themselves. They picked it up from American conspiracy theorists in the LGBTQ, of course, at the time called gay community, where it was making the rounds already. And that leads to two fascinating observations. One, sometimes the most effective active measures simply amplify existing conspiracy theories. And that is, in fact, often the case. And the second one is, imagine you're the KGB officer writing that memo to your partners in Germany, in East Germany, or in Bulgaria, asking them to help you spread the myth. One is, you're just telling them to do it, and they will not understand what is misinformation and what is correct information, because it's a blend of both. So what you see internally is essentially a form of self-disinformation, that large bureaucracies, when they engage in these campaigns over years, will lose the ability to clearly see what is false information and what is correct information. And even worse than that, because they are amplifying something that is already existing, they will often fall for a temptation to exaggerate their effect. Because it's impossible to say, where does the original conspiracy theory end and where does their own amplification begin? So the effect is self-disinformation and self-exaggeration of their own effects. Now, that creates a pernicious effect, because that leads bureaucracies to believe that what they're doing here is, very, very impactful, although it may not be. And I would just provoke, you and our viewers here by observing that we run the risk here in the United States, in the way we discussed what happened in 2016, to basically write the after-action reviews that overstate the effect of what happened for the intelligence agencies involved.
You mean, just to be clear here, you mean overstate the effectiveness of Russian operations in the effect
Totally.
of the election? Yeah.
Historically, the temptation was that the perpetrators exaggerated their own effect internally for bureaucratic reasons. But usually the victims of disinformation operations, that is the case in many operations that played out in West Germany, for example. Usually the victim didn't really play along in exaggerating the effects. But in 2016, I think we see this rather extraordinary situation that the Mueller investigation, and of course the entire conversation about the Russian interference, which was the top news item for a very long time, for years, almost more than years. I mean, since the election, it's been a top news item on and off. We run the risk of exaggerating and doing their work for them ultimately.
I want to come back in a second to Operation Denver, Thomas, but let me go to Heather. Heather, Thomas raised the issue of 2016 elections. So I wanted to give you the chance to provide your perspective on that, including Russian intention, and Thomas's issue of overstating the significance of it.
Thanks, Seth. So I think for me, it's really important to take a quick step back. This is Russian operations. It is military doctrine. It's called New Generation Warfare. There's nothing new about the techniques and tactics of active measures, of course, but it is warfare. And these are ongoing campaigns. We tend to over-focus on the election period because, of course, an election is an opportunity to sow seeds of distrust and be very disruptive. But these are ongoing campaigns, the seeds of which have been planted years before, and that they are pulled. And sometimes different tools are used pending the situation. Sometimes they don't need to be used. So it's a strategy of influence to break the internal coherence of the democratic system. So it's to break faith and trust between the governed and the government and those institutions. And why is that important, particularly for Russian disinformation? I mean, that is what makes, in the United States, in some ways, America exceptional. It's democracy, it's constitution, how it works. When you break faith with that, you're no longer exceptional, you're the moral equivalent of Russia. And without that distinction, and with a deeply divided government and people, you're a country and a government that can be much more accommodative to Russian interests. So there's a real purpose to this. An election obviously is an important moment for that, but these are ongoing efforts to divide society. So I agree with Thomas. Sometimes I've always felt that if we handled this with confidence, with our allies and partners, we can overcome this, because it's simply the weaknesses that we are offering is what the Russians are amplifying. If we heal our cleavages, they'll have a lot less to amplify. So we can talk about Russian tactics and tools until we're blue in the face, but what it comes down to is making sure that we are healing the divisions within our society, and that we then can turn with a projection of a positive agenda and confidence. What the Russians fear the most is our democracy working in Russia. And so again, to return back to that positive spirit. So we can't give them too much credit. We have to focus on healing the divisions. And the problem is, and I think this is for me more in the US context, and there's obviously quite a bit of division within Europe as well, is that exactly as Thomas said, it's very hard to right now detect where we stop and where the Russians begin. We are delegitimizing our own election today. Elected leaders are saying daily that this election is going to be rigged. I mean, you don't need to have a foreign actor help you anymore, because you're already delegitimizing your own democracy, you're delegitimizing your leaders and in your institutions. When you cripple the judicial system and law enforcement, or you delegitimize them, you've done so much damage that the Russians can certainly amplify that, and they're using far-right extremism, conspiracy groups groups to do that today. But we're already working quite well in that path. So it's very hard in some ways for me to overjudge the Russians when I believe a lot of the healing and the work that has to be done is within our own society, within European societies, to heal some of these longstanding divisions. Thanks,
Heather. Thomas, if I can come back briefly to Denver, Operation Denver, in part because some have argued that there are interesting parallels, there are also huge differences with what we've seen coming out of Tehran, Beijing, Moscow, and even Washington about the origins of COVID-19. Some have argued that it was manufactured in US laboratories. The US has actually done the same with China, that it was potentially manufactured in Chinese laboratories. So from your perspective, how is this similar or different from from other campaigns we've seen historically?
Yeah, I mean, a pandemic, and AIDS was a pandemic in the early 80s as well, in the early mid 80s, is of course the best raw material that you can wish for disinformation and active measures. Why? Because people are genuinely scared. There's a lot of uncertainty, and political divisions will open up around how to react to the pandemic. So that's all you need to run an operation and to exploit it. But here in this case, I would just want to let a little bit of time pass. You know, when I wrote my book, and the book is very ambitious, it goes from throughout the entire Cold War up to 2016. And as we transition from into the 1990s, and when the intelligence archives essentially closed, I have no longer, almost no documentation after 1990, other than output of operations, digital forensics, for example. You can see the fog rise. You can see how it becomes much harder to really come to high confidence conclusions about objectives, about success, etc. So I think it's important to just be clear today that what we see, of course, is officials make statements, but we don't have visibility into into why they do it, into their own rationale, and of course, we don't have visibility into the covert and semi-covert operations that are happening at the same time.
Thanks. Thomas, I think it would be helpful for folks listening to also get a broader perspective of how this has been done historically. Can you talk a little bit about some Cold War cases? In your book, you walk through a number of them. Swastikas in Germany, racial engineering, the World Peace Council, and what are the similarities and differences to today?
Yeah, so let's talk about the 1959-1960 anti-Semitic campaign that KGB put on in West Germany and in fact around the world. It started at the newly reopened Great Synagogue in Cologne that had just been reopened by Adenauer in September 59, and then on Christmas 59, swastikas and Jews out was daubed on the entrance of the synagogue. And of course, a firestorm broke out in Germany in terms of the media coverage. Within a short amount of time, we saw nearly around 900 anti-Semitic incidents within the space of just a few weeks in Germany and in the near abroad, around like in France, in the UK, but also in the United States in 15 different cities, including in New York and Manhattan and on Long Island. But the media coverage of the case was intense. Germany was seen as regressing into the dark times that many people thought would be behind Germany, into anti-Semitism, Holocaust. And the operation, and we have very good evidence for this today, was an active measure, was a provocation on the part of KGB to exploit the simmering trauma that Germany was trying to get out of. And when I talk about this operation today, there will be, and I am German myself, there will be Germans who say, wait a minute, you're saying that that Germany needed Russian help or KGB help to to commit anti-Semitic acts in the 1950s. Are you kidding? And of course, that's exactly the point of active measures. They take something that is existing and then amplify it. So this campaign is the perfect example. KGB very quickly was, and obviously there's a degree of speculation when I say this, but I'm confident. KGB was quickly not in a position anymore to distinguish the fake anti-Semitic acts from the real anti-Semitic acts that it provoked. We know this because even in East Berlin, there were anti-Semitic incidents that essentially creeped across the wall, which of course was completely against their own interests. But it's a fascinating, this is why active measures are called active measures. They are active and they will actively shape reality. So that is, I think, one of the most extraordinary examples that we see. I also want to highlight one point that I think often gets lost, and that is around the time of that operation in the early 60s to late 60s, throughout the 60s, we see a de-escalation in the West. We see CIA pulling out of the political warfare. That's how they called it internally, political warfare game. So fewer forgeries, no more aggressive front organizations in Berlin, for example, which was a thing in the 50s. And we see an escalation in the Soviet bloc, the opposite trend. So that is a really important observation. We have no moral equivalency here. To put it bluntly, you can't excel at democracy and disinformation at the same time.
Good point. Heather, which leads me to a broad question for you is, as we look towards the future, and this comes out of one of the questions that one of our viewers has asked, do we see evidence of close US-EU cooperation to fight disinformation? And there's clearly an underlying issue there, which is there also is a substantial disagreement between many European countries and the US, but there's a broader issue when we look at Hungary, for example. So how do you see US-EU collaboration, both positive developments, but also huge challenges?
So it's where the U.S. and EU should be cooperating the most closely. And in many ways, for Russian disinformation, Europe has been a laboratory for decades. And I think in some ways, what caught us so by surprise in 2016, I don't think we had the audacity to think that the Russians would be so audacious in bringing many of those tactics and techniques to the US, quite frankly. And I agree with you, what surprises us sometimes creates an overreaction. But this is exactly where we need to be together, intelligence services working together, but really political leaders ensuring that there is a strong sense of transparency and trust. Trust of institutions and leaders, but transparency into what government is doing. As Thomas said, I mean, most of this disinformation is pulling into those threads that already exist. So there should be a huge area of collaboration. I think there are good government-to-government linkages, but really at the highest level, there is not the level that I think we should be, thinking about. The future, and this is what is, and in the example of Hungary is quite perfect, and that is where ongoing disinformation campaigns, or I would say influence activities, which pull governments or leaders towards their benefactors. So in Hungary, a close relationship between Prime Minister Orban and President Putin and Xi Jinping as well allows in some ways those governments to then work against, when the European Union needs unanimity of all 27 of its members to have a statement that may be critical of Beijing, or that may take additional efforts to perhaps block Russian activities. If a member state or two have already been compromised, they're not going to allow that policy to move forward, which breaks, again, the internal coherence of the European Union when you have one or two members for their own national interests have made the decision to go against it. So it makes it extremely difficult. And when one starts following, then you see others moving in similar directions, and a precedent is set. And that's my other fear, that Hungary in some ways was just an early adopter of potentially trends that other EU members, smaller ones in particular, may gravitate towards. So I think it's an enormous challenge.
Thomas, one of the questions from one of the viewers gets back to a question I asked earlier. We didn't end up getting to it, but let me re-ask it. Is what are the tools that governments use and the mediums that they use? You've pointed out in the past, not just social media, but it can also include offensive cyber operations, hacking, and then leaking that information. So how do you see options available to states?
Yeah, the tool set, the active measure tool set is a very large box with a lot of different tools in it. Leaking files is historically one of the most effective tools, because as soon as you have information that is somebody's trying to hide, could be correspondence or secret, top secret information, that of course has high news value. So what we often see historically, and we see that even play out in Ukraine in 2014, there are many instances of leaks that contain forgeries. Not just forgeries about where the leak comes from, but actual content forgeries. So that is something that I think we should absolutely expect in the future. Don't think leaks are clean and pure material that can just be reported, be used for news coverage. They are likely to contain some form of forgery, which means you can't just fact check one thing and then conclude that the rest is correct. You have to fact check every single detail that journalists, for example, will write about based on a leaked information. Another tool in the active measures tool set beyond leaking and forging is, of course, front organizations. We see sometimes front organizations existing for a very long time, more than a decade, evolving, sometimes out in the sort of semi-open. Sometimes there are rumors going around. That was the case for some American front organizations in Berlin, that it could be linked to CIA, but that doesn't stop the front organization. So front organization could be publishing houses, magazines, could be activist groups. And of course,
would you include, Thomas, would you include like the World Peace Council as a front organization, for example?
Yeah, the World Peace Council is one of the better known ones. But I have several that I discuss in the book with a lot of archival evidence. So there was one particularly impressive one that was run by CIA in the 1950s, known as PR Office Kramer. Cryptonym was LC Cassock. That one is just fascinating because we have the full set of project files. So we can talk about it with a lot of detail, and how we can tell the story of how CIA controlled it and evolved it and lost control ultimately. But I just briefly wanted to mention not just front organizations, but this culture of anonymity that the internet unleashed in the early 2000s. Literally, the anonymous movement with the Guy Fawkes masks was really a dream come true for active measures for disinformation operators, because you could suddenly hide false or accurate leaked information behind the virtual facade of an anonymous activist group. This is almost a mix of a front organization and a new form of internet culture. So we see that weird convergence of internet culture and active measures in the after 2013.
Good. So I am rolling through some of the viewer questions now. This one, Heather, I'm going to direct to you, which is how significant is disinformation during this COVID-19 in terms of political gains, including the re-election of officials? I mean, obviously, this is relevant in the U.S. as much as it is in other countries.
Well, I would say, quite frankly, not disinformation, but performance. Government performance is probably the biggest game changer, quite frankly, in terms of political gains. The disinformation dynamic, I think that for me, this comes back to sort of trust and credibility. And you see a wide range of political responses to how they're dealing with, again, trust, transparency, credibility, whether science is involved in this. Some political figures have used the science to shape their views and their statements and the information they're sharing. Others have not. Some have hidden behind it. Some have gotten out in front of it. So I think, quite frankly, the disinformation certainly is an element of it. I would say geopolitically, though, this is where I would put it into the scapegoating era. What we're seeing is some political leaders, because they've been challenged by their response, it is now time to scapegoat. And this gets into the ecosystem, quite frankly, of the far extremist, conspiracy-laden voices. So the attacks you're seeing, again, the personalities, the Bill Gates, even the George Soros, there's some anti-Semitic tropes that are coming through that. It's blaming the other for lack of a response. That to me is a growing sense of disinformation that I think citizens will have to weigh when it comes time to hold the election. I would just say, Seth, one other comment to Thomas's note. What I think in the future, what we're going to see is this is going to become, particularly in the Russian case, certainly less Russian and much more organic to the voices. And this is where I think the evolution of tactics of Russian disinformation. In 2016, we could see the Russian, they were paying in rubles. Now we're seeing where specific campaigns, the infiltration of private chat rooms and things like that, they're now becoming much more organic to the voice of their own societies, which I think is certainly enhances the effort, because they know the issues that will exacerbate existing societal tensions. So this is going to get harder to combat as we go, particularly in the US and others where First Amendment and speech protection is so important. The lines are so blurred from that which is amplified by Russia and juiced up by Russian on both sides, but which is organically either an American organization or a European organization that believes in these theories.
Heather, just a follow up for you. And this comes from one of the questions that somebody asked. Can you just talk very briefly, to the degree that we understand it, what organizations in Russia, like the GRU, for example, are involved, and what are the tactics that they're using, and how do we educate people in the US along those lines? So this is coming from one of our viewers.
Oh, tough, multi-layered questions. Again, I think you're seeing, again, this is where, in some ways, the Mueller report and other investigations from the 2016 election interference, we do have a sense of knowing that particularly the cyber units within the GRU that are responsible for some of the hacking, the forgery of documents, the Internet Research Agency and other amplifiers of messages. So I think we know where they're coming from, but it comes back to the education of the citizen and having greater literacy efforts, particularly when it comes to detecting when you sense information and you're getting something from a friend and you're not sure it's right. How do you fact check it? Where are sources of information? And that needs to be happening, quite frankly, in the grade school level. Children need to be taught this. Adults need to be kept abreast. We need public service announcements that help people be able to discern disinformation, know it, recognize it, be able to combat it. These are the types of efforts, I think, an educated population, knowing the tactics and the tools, but again, it gets back to exploiting the weaknesses. A deeply divided and polarized society just gives so much opportunity to amplify and accentuate those divisions. Healing the divisions and making more alert of foreign actors trying to exacerbate those divisions will go a long way, but just a more bipartisan, more community unified effort, I think would be extremely helpful. And listening to people that you respect, not necessarily at the top levels of government, but your church
like
leaders.
The two of you, for example.
Community leaders, people that you trust, listening to them.
No reason to go that far, Seth. But can I jump in real quick here as well? You know, I'm going to provoke a few viewers here. I think a lot of Americans today think that the Russian election interference of 2016 resulted in Donald Trump becoming president. Essentially that the Russians installed Donald Trump through their sophisticated, or helped installing Donald Trump through their sophisticated election interference. That is, the evidence that we have does not back up that conclusion. In fact, it's an unknowable fact to what extent the Russian election interference had an impact on Donald Trump winning the election. But we have a lot of people in the US, especially of course on the Democrat side, have an emotional issue with the president. Probably many Republicans have as well. And they default too quickly into dismissing views that sound to them like extreme disinformation, as thinking it's sort of probably foreign influenced. Certainly back in 2016 and actually 17, that was a huge tendency. And of course, that is a risk in itself. I would go as far as saying that our perception of Russian interference is creating more of a problem than the Russian interference itself. Why? Because if a democracy starts blaming domestic problems on foreign interference, then it is beginning to do what weakening what countries like Russia and Turkey are doing. Blaming domestic ills on foreign interference is something that weakening democracies do. So we should resist that temptation.
So one question that's a follow-up, Thomas, for you is, how did both the Soviet Union and the U.S. respond? I mean, you talked about actions that they took during the Cold War, including the AIDS campaign from the KGB, some CIA efforts. How did they also respond to disinformation campaigns coming from the other side, and what are lessons that you take for today?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because the response changes over time, and it's also different in the US versus the Soviet Union over time. But in the 60s, I think the Soviet response was escalation. I think we can see a dynamic of US political warfare provoking more Soviet disinformation active measures operations. But that's only a dynamic that lasts for a short amount of time in the 60s. And what you see later is in the 80s, for example, in the early 80s, the US government, CIA especially, but also the State Department and to a degree FBI as well, start publishing information and through Congress, often through the congressional record and hearings, that exposes ongoing Soviet active measures in great detail. Some of this material is extraordinary research material. And that I think made a difference. It educated the public. It made a lot of journalists, journalists expected to be tricked in the 1980s and already before then. Sometimes they were successfully tricked, and oftentimes they turned the disinformation story into the story itself. So I think exposure of operations, but in a cautious, sober, fact-driven way is a time-tested response.
So, Thomas, what's the challenge? Are you confident that you're seeing that in the US, for example?
I am actually quite confident. Yeah, no, I see some positive trends and a few problematic trends. The positive trends, of course, are that a lot of people are expecting disinformation today. So I think it's still possible to leak information and have it covered in a big ticket way, but it's a little harder than it used to be. In 2016, the Russian tradecraft that we saw in 2016, and I was watching it in real time, was very bad. They made so many mistakes. So, and still were relatively successful on the leaking side. That is different today. Obviously WikiLeaks is no longer an outlet that they can easily exploit as easily as it was in 2016. And a lot of people are expecting it today. But their operational security, I think Heather alluded to that, is getting better. But look at it from the point of view of GRU or SVR. They are up against towering expectations and against social media companies that are, much better prepared, against public and a press corps in the United States that is much better prepared. So in a way, the US is, despite of its extraordinary polarization, probably a harder target than it was in 2016.
Thanks. Interesting as we move into presidential election season. So you get the last question, Heather, and the big part of the question from one of the viewers is how can democracies stick to democratic values of free and open flow of ideas while at the same time dealing with disinformation from authoritarian countries? And as an anecdote, I'm going to pick up another question. So that's sort of the big question on democracies and democratic values. But the anecdote is China has supported COVID-19 with positive reinforcements by sending medical supplies to Europe, somebody points out. So, how can the US and its allies prevent subversive influence from these positive reinforcements? So, the question really gets to what democratic countries should and should not be doing.
No, it's a great question. And in some ways, it's going back to basics. It's going back to the essentials of transparencies of democratic governments and institutions and rebuilding trust between citizens. And that has been waning, both of those have been waning for a great deal of time. We now have to have the urgency of rebuilding those because foreign actors, state and non-state, are now using them. Trust me, it's much cheaper to disassemble a democracy than fight a conventional conflict. And this is the cheaper variation of that. So we have to go back to those basics. And as Thomas Jefferson said, you need an informed citizenry. Citizens need to be informed and they need to take personal responsibility for their own security, their information security, their cyber security. This is how we protect our democracy, how we protect national security. Everyone has a part to play. Everyone has to see their role to play in not sharing disinformation to make sure that they have trusted factual information to make informed decisions, whether it's their elected leaders or their laws. So that back to basics moment could not be, in civic education, it could not be more apparent, but it seems that we're struggling with getting back to that simplicity. On China, in some ways, the provision of humanitarian assistance during a crisis of this magnitude should be warmly accepted. China was certainly sending this, particularly to the European countries that were the most devastated, Spain, Italy, France, elsewhere. They had two issues. The supplies themselves were faulty. Some of the tests and the masks and things were just not up to standards, so they were not able to be used. And when governments were criticizing the quality of that medical assistance, this is when Chinese diplomacy became incredibly aggressive. Any criticism of the Communist Party and of the leadership and their gifts was really dealt with, which created its own backlash. So in some ways, the positive, what we would call soft diplomacy of sending medical assistance, humanitarian aid, has ended up backfiring. I think it's created, obviously, a concern, very strong concern and heightened awareness that even the provision of humanitarian supplies came with some strings attached, meaning you could not criticize the Chinese government. So it's not been well received necessarily, but for those that were in need, and some of the equipment was important at that moment. So stay tuned. This is going to be a much more dynamic era with Chinese diplomacy, both in Europe, of course, but the fact that the US isn't working more closely with its allies in trying to prevent that is unfortunately creating opportunities for Chinese disinformation to actually be more successful than it should be.
Thanks, Heather.
Yeah.
Thomas, do you want to weigh in just briefly?
Yes, please. Thank you. The temptation here for the United States intelligence community at some point, I think, will be to give in and try to take the gloves off. Now, what does it mean to take the gloves off here? Occasionally, when I speak with people in the national security establishment in different countries, they think that active measures should be countered with active measures, fight fire with fire. But I think that would be very problematic. Right now, the incentive for the intelligence community in the US is the right one. The incentive is understand, in a sober, fact-driven analysis, understand what happened in how this pandemic started, how China is using its leverage in Europe to put other governments under pressure, etc. Do intelligence reporting, thorough, fact-driven reporting and assessment and analysis. Of course, the incentive structure in the White House appears to be slightly different, not so focused on sober, fact-based assessments. The risk here is that at some point over time, and we're seeing some signs that this is happening, that the IC, the intelligence community, will become more politicized and put under pressure to, take the gloves off, as I said. That would be a highly problematic trend line, because in a very ideological environment, like in communist intelligence services in the 1960s, when you train the muscle that is producing forgeries, disinformation at scale over time, you will lose credibility internally among your allies and become less able to respond in a fact-based, democratic way. So don't, let's be careful here. And finally, just very briefly, for what everybody can do is, are you following people on Twitter or on other social media outlets that occasionally say things that you completely disagree with? Because if you isolate yourself in a self-reinforcing bubble of opinions, and you tend to only confirm your own views when you go online, then you are making yourself more susceptible to disinformation. So find people to disagree with.
Great. Those are good instructions for everybody listening and their daily habits of what they watch on television, what they read in papers, who they follow on Twitter, to make sure we're being collectively as a society as objective as possible. Thank you very much to Thomas Rid, again, Professor of Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and author of a fantastic book out, Active Measures, The Secret History of Disinformation and Political Warfare, and Heather Conley, Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, the Arctic, Director of the Europe Program at CSIS, and the author of the Kremlin Playbook and Kremlin Playbook 2, among many other great publications. Thank you both for your participation in a real serious look and an objective one at disinformation, political warfare, and other comparable terms. Thanks, everyone. And
thank you, Seth.
We'll see you online.